The landing craft rocked violently as it approached the black volcanic shores of Iwo Jima. February 19, 1945. Sergeant Andrew Drew Calloway gripped his radio set, eyes fixed on the island's most dominant feature, Mount Suribachi, rising 550 feet above the churning Pacific. Artillery shells screamed overhead, kicking up massive geysers of water around the approaching fleet. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with diesel fumes and salt spray as thousands of United States Marines prepared to storm what military intelligence had assured would be a 3-day operation. Calloway knew better. As the communications specialist for Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, he had intercepted Japanese transmissions that painted a different picture. 21,000 entrenched defenders, miles of interconnected tunnels, heavy artillery pre-sighted on every landing zone. 2 minutes, shouted the coxswain over the thunder of naval bombardment. Calloway adjusted his backpack radio, a standard-issue SCR 300, the same model that had repeatedly failed in the humid Pacific conditions. For months, he had been quietly modifying the sets against regulations, waterproofing components, with a mixture of rubber cement and paraffin wax from ration candles. His commanding officer had ordered him to stop these unauthorized modifications after a supply officer reported the alterations. "Standard issue means standard issue, Sergeant," the captain had said firmly. "We can't have every radio man in the Pacific creating his own equipment." But as the ramp of the landing craft crashed down into the shallow water off Iwo Jima, Calloway knew that standard wouldn't be enough. The entire assault depended on communication, artillery coordination, naval gunfire support, reinforcement requests, casualty reports, all flowing through the hands of radio men like himself. And when radios failed, Marines died. No one in the 5th Marine Division knew that one man's defiance of equipment regulations that morning would rewrite the course of one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific theater, preserving a communication lifeline that would ultimately save thousands of lives and accelerate victory by weeks. Andrew Calloway was born on September 12, 1922, in Meridian, Mississippi, the third son of a railroad mechanic and a schoolteacher. From his earliest days, Drew displayed an uncanny talent for understanding how things worked. While other boys played baseball in the dusty streets of Depression-era Meridian, young Drew could be found in his father's workshop, disassembling discarded radios, telephones, and any other electronic devices he could salvage from junk piles. That boy could fix anything with moving parts, his father would proudly tell neighbors. Doesn't matter if it's broke beyond saving. Drew sees patterns in the chaos. His mother fostered his love of learning, bringing home science books from the school library where she taught. By age 12, Drew had built his first crystal radio set from scavenged parts. By 16, he was repairing radios for half the county, earning enough to help his family through the last difficult years of the Depression. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Drew was studying electrical engineering at Mississippi State College on a partial scholarship, working nights at a local radio repair shop to cover remaining expenses. Like thousands of young Americans, he felt the immediate call to serve. Unlike many, he had a specific vision for his contribution. "I want to be where communication matters most," he told the Marine Corps recruiter in January 1942. "Put me where the right message at the right time can save lives." The Corps recognized his talent immediately. After basic training at Parris Island, where he struggled with the physical demands but excelled in technical aptitude tests, he was assigned to communication school at Camp Pendleton. There, instructors noted his exceptional ability to not only master standard operating procedures, but to improve upon them. "Calloway thinks 3 steps ahead," wrote his communications instructor. "Troubleshoots equipment failures before they occur. Recommend advanced technical training and field deployment." Yet Drew's tendency to modify equipment created friction. Military organizations prized standardization, and Calloway's improvements, while effective, violated protocols. During field exercises in the California hills, he waterproofed radio battery compartments with petroleum jelly, reinforced connection points with copper wire, salvaged from artillery shell casings, and developed a system for rapidly changing frequencies that shaved precious seconds off standard procedures. His innovations earned him both admirers and critics. Fellow radiomen sought his advice, while supply officers and some commanding officers viewed his modifications as potential liabilities. By the time he joined the newly formed 5th Marine Division in 1944, Sergeant Calloway had earned a reputation, brilliant with communications equipment, but prone to bending regulations when standard issue gear proved inadequate. These radios were designed for European conditions, he explained to his platoon lieutenant after being reprimanded for unauthorized modifications. The humidity and salt air in the Pacific destroys the internal components within weeks. Sir, when these fail in combat, Marines die. The lieutenant, a former infantry officer from Nebraska with little technical background, remained unmoved. "Follow procedures, Sergeant." "That's an order." Calloway nodded respectfully, but in his footlocker, wrapped in waterproof canvas, he kept his special tools and materials. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between his fellow Marines and annihilation. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. American forces had fought their way across the Central and Western Pacific in a series of increasingly costly amphibious operations. The island-hopping strategy conceived by Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur had pushed Japanese forces back toward their home islands, but at tremendous cost. Each successive landing, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, had grown more difficult as Japanese defenders perfected their defensive tactics. No longer attempting to repel landings at the water's edge, Japanese commanders now focused on bleeding American forces through prepared defenses in depth. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, cave networks, and suicide counterattacks made each island a nightmare for attacking Marines and soldiers. Communication between advancing units became the critical vulnerability, as artillery support, naval gunfire, and tactical coordination all depended on functioning radio networks. Iwo Jima represented the apotheosis of this defensive strategy. Located 750 miles from Tokyo, the small volcanic island held tremendous strategic value. Its airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for B-29 Super Fortress bombers returning from raids on the Japanese mainland, and as bases for fighter escorts. More importantly, it was Japanese soil, formerly part of the Tokyo Administrative District, making it the first piece of the Japanese homeland to face American assault. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's defender, had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress. Unlike previous Japanese commanders who sacrificed troops in banzai charges, Kuribayashi forbade such tactics. His 21,000 troops were ordered to exact maximum casualties from the Americans while remaining alive to continue fighting. Miles of tunnels connected defensive positions, allowing Japanese forces to appear, fire, and disappear before American heavy weapons could respond. "No part of this island is safe from our guns," Kuribayashi told his officers. "We will kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost." American intelligence severely underestimated both the number of defenders and the sophistication of their preparations. Initial estimates suggested a 3 to 5 day operation. The pre-invasion bombardment, while impressive in scale with thousands of tons of explosives delivered by battleships and carrier aircraft, proved largely ineffective against the deeply buried Japanese positions. When the first wave of Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they encountered minimal resistance, a deliberate tactic by Kuribayashi, who had ordered his men to hold fire until the beaches were crowded with Americans. Then, at a predetermined moment, every Japanese gun on the island opened fire on the landing zones. What followed was systematic slaughter. Mortars and artillery rained down with deadly accuracy. Machine guns swept the beaches with interlocking fire. Snipers targeted officers and radiomen specifically. Within hours, the careful organization of the landing force disintegrated into isolated groups fighting for survival. In this chaos, communication became the difference between life and death. And as Kuribayashi had anticipated, American radios began to fail in large numbers, victims of salt water, volcanic ash, and battle damage. The dawn of February 23, 1945, broke gray and cheerless over Iwo Jima. 4 days into what was supposed to have been a 72-hour operation, the Marines had secured less than a quarter of the island at the cost of thousands of casualties. Sergeant Drew Calloway hadn't slept more than 20 minutes at a stretch since landing, moving constantly between scattered units of the 28th Marines to maintain their fragile communication network. The night before, a desperate message had come down from battalion headquarters, Mount Suribachi, the volcano dominating the southern end of the island, needed to be taken. Too many Japanese observation posts remained active on its slopes, directing devastating artillery fire on the American positions and the continuing landings. 3 previous attempts to scale the mountain had been repulsed with heavy losses. "We're going up again at 0800, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson told his company commanders in a crater that served as a temporary command post. Easy Company will lead, supported by Fox and Dog. I need reliable communications throughout the assault. The Navy guns need to know exactly where to place supporting fire." All eyes turned to Calloway, who was repairing a radio damaged by shrapnel, his fingers black with volcanic grit and electrical grease. "Can you guarantee communications, Sergeant?" Colonel Johnson asked. Calloway looked up from his work. "No, sir, I cannot, not with standard equipment." The command post fell silent. In the distance, Japanese heavy guns fired another salvo toward the beaches. "Explain," Johnson said quietly. "Sir, the SCR-300s weren't designed for these conditions. Volcanic ash is getting into the frequency modulators, and the humidity is shorting connection points. Standard waterproofing measures aren't sufficient. Of the 12 sets that landed with our battalion, only 4 are still functioning, and those intermittently." Captain Dave Severance, Easy Company's commander, leaned forward. "What do you suggest, Sergeant?" Calloway hesitated. He had been modifying his own radio sets against orders for months. Now, with hundreds of lives in the balance, he had to decide whether to admit his insubordination. "Sir, I've developed some field modifications that significantly improve performance in these conditions. Applied to the remaining sets, they could give us reliable communications throughout the assault." "What kind of modifications?" Colonel Johnson asked, his expression unreadable. "Paraffin coating on all internal connections, rubber gaskets harvested from Japanese equipment to seal connection points, copper wire reinforcement of the antenna assemblies, and a frequency calibration technique that cuts through Japanese jamming attempts." The operations officer interrupted. "Those modifications violate equipment protocols. Supply will have a fit." "Supply isn't climbing that volcano tomorrow," Captain Severance replied sharply. Colonel Johnson studied Calloway for a long moment. "Have you been making these modifications all along, Sergeant, despite orders to the contrary?" Calloway met his commander's gaze. "Yes, sir, I have." Another artillery barrage walked across the American lines, closer this time. The command post shook with the impacts. "How long to modify all remaining sets?" Johnson asked. 6 hours, sir, working through the night." The colonel nodded once. "Do it. And, Sergeant, if this works, there will be no official record of these modifications. If it fails, the responsibility is yours alone." Calloway understood perfectly. "Yes, sir." As he gathered the remaining radio sets, Captain Severance stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "We're counting on you, Drew. That mountain has killed enough Marines." Through the night, by the light of a single shielded flashlight, Sergeant Calloway worked methodically on each radio. His hands, steady despite 36 hours without sleep, disassembled and reassembled the delicate components. From his personal kit came the hoarded supplies: paraffin, copper wire, rubber cement, and gaskets carefully removed from captured Japanese equipment. 4 other radiomen watched intently as he demonstrated his techniques. "The key is creating a moisture barrier around the frequency module," he explained. applying a thin layer of paraffin to the critical component, and reinforcing the antenna connection point with additional copper. Japanese jamming tends to focus on disrupting our standard frequencies, so will offset by 0.3 kilohertz, enough to maintain clarity without straying outside our assigned band. By dawn, 7 SCR-300 radios had been modified, tested, and distributed to key positions within the assault force. Each radio man received hasty training in maintaining the modifications under combat conditions. Remember, Calloway told them, if questioned, these are emergency field repairs, not modifications. There's a difference in the regulations. At precisely 0800 hours, Easy Company began their ascent of Mount Suribachi. 40 men led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier moved up the northern slope, followed by elements of Fox Company. Calloway, carrying his modified radio on his back, stayed close to Lieutenant Schreier. They expected heavy resistance at any moment. Strangely, the Japanese defenders seemed subdued. Occasional sniper fire and light mortars harassed the climbing Marines, but nothing like the murderous fusillades of previous days. Unknown to the Americans, most of the Japanese garrison on Suribachi had withdrawn through tunnels to the northern end of the island during the night, following Kuribayashi's strategy of sequential defense. The real test of Calloway's modifications came 90 minutes into the climb, when Japanese heavy artillery from the north opened fire on the exposed Marines. Lieutenant Schreier immediately called for naval gunfire support to suppress the enemy batteries. Sierra 3 to Warship 9, request fire mission over, he spoke into the handset. In previous days, such calls had disappeared into static or failed entirely. This time, the response was immediate and clear. Warship 9 to Sierra 3, send mission over. Calloway felt a surge of validation as the coordinates were transmitted flawlessly. Within minutes, the 16-inch guns of the USS New York responded, their massive shells screaming overhead to slam into the Japanese positions with devastating accuracy. Communications are holding, Lieutenant, Calloway reported as they continued upward. All units are in contact. Schreier nodded grimly. Let's get to the top before they figure out what we're doing. At 10:20 hours, the patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The view was breathtaking. The entire island spread before them, the massive American fleet offshore, and thousands of Marines fighting across the black volcanic landscape. More importantly, they could see Japanese gun positions that had been invisible from the ground. Lieutenant Schreier immediately began calling in coordinates for naval gunfire and airstrikes. Calloway's radio performed flawlessly, maintaining clear communication despite the exposed position and electromagnetic interference from nearby naval vessels. Sierra 3 to Battery Alpha, new target, heavy gun emplacement, at coordinates TER 7345. Fire for effect. Within moments, American artillery responded, obliterating a Japanese position that had been harassing the advancing Marines for days. Similar calls followed in rapid succession as the observation post atop Suribachi revolutionized the American fire support capability. Then came a historic request from Lieutenant Schreier. Send up a flag. A small American flag taken from a Navy landing craft was brought forward. As Marines secured it to a length of pipe found among the debris, Calloway made another call that would resonate through history. Sierra 3 to base, American flag being raised on Mount Suribachi. Time, 10:37. The flag went up, snapping in the strong ocean breeze. Across the island, Marines looked up, saw the stars and stripes flying over the highest point on Iwo Jima, and cheered. Ships offshore sounded their horns. The moment was captured by combat photographer Louis Lowry. Later that afternoon, a larger flag would replace this first one in the now famous image captured by Joe Rosenthal. But it was Calloway's radio, modified against regulations, that ensured the coordinated assault succeeded, and that news of the achievement spread instantly across the battlefield, galvanizing the American forces. As the day progressed, the strategic value of Calloway's modifications became increasingly apparent. With reliable communications from the Suribachi observation post, American firepower was directed with unprecedented precision against Japanese positions. Artillery batteries that had tormented the Marines for days were systematically destroyed. Counterattacks were broken up before they could fully form. Casualties among advancing American units dropped significantly as they received timely warnings of enemy movements. Colonel Johnson, visiting the summit position late that afternoon, found Calloway still at his post, eyes red-rimmed from fatigue but alert, coordinating communications for multiple fire missions. "Your radios are working, Sergeant," the colonel observed, the understatement deliberate. "Yes, sir. All modified sets are operational. We've maintained continuous communication for over 8 hours in conditions that would have disabled a standard equipment within 30 minutes. Johnson nodded, surveying the battlefield below, where American forces were making their best progress since the landing. Supply officer estimates we've lost 70% of our radio equipment in 4 days of fighting. That's consistent with previous operations in the Pacific. Yes, sir. Yet every one of your modified sets remains functional. So far, sir. The colonel was silent for a moment, watching as another salvo of naval gunfire struck a Japanese position with pinpoint accuracy, directed by coordinates provided through Calloway's communication network. The battalion intelligence officer estimates you've helped eliminate 16 major enemy gun positions today, Johnson said finally. Conservative casualty projections suggest you've saved between 800 and 1,000 Marine lives. Calloway had no response to this. The numbers seemed abstract compared to the very concrete reality of his fellow Marines fighting below. "I'm putting you in for a commendation, Sergeant." "Sir, the modifications were against direct orders." "What modifications?" Johnson replied evenly. "My report will cite emergency field repairs to standard equipment under combat conditions. Outstanding initiative in maintaining communication capabilities essential to the success of a critical operation." Before Calloway could respond, his radio crackled with another request for fire support. As he relayed the coordinates to an offshore destroyer, Colonel Johnson departed with a final comment. "Carry on, Sergeant. And when we rotate back to base, I want a detailed report on these field repairs of yours. The entire Pacific Fleet needs to know." Word spread quickly among the communication units. By the 3rd day after the Suribachi assault, radiomen throughout the 5th Marine Division were implementing Calloway's modifications. By the end of the week, the adjacent 4th Marine Division had adopted them as well. Communications reliability across the American forces increased dramatically, allowing for more coordinated attacks, more responsive artillery support, and fewer friendly fire incidents. Japanese commanders noted the change in American capabilities with alarm. Major Hideo Tokushima, one of General Kuribayashi's staff officers who survived the battle, later wrote in his captured diary, "The Americans have overcome their communication difficulties too quickly. Their artillery suddenly strikes with perfect accuracy where before it was scattered and ineffective. Something has changed in their capabilities, and we are suffering the consequences." What had changed was Andrew Calloway's willingness to defy regulations in service of a higher purpose, keeping his fellow Marines alive. His modifications, born of practical experience and technical ingenuity, represented exactly the kind of adaptability that Japanese military doctrine, with its emphasis on rigid adherence to orders, struggled to match. The battle for Iwo Jima would rage for another month, ultimately claiming the lives of nearly 7,000 Americans and virtually the entire Japanese garrison. But the tide had turned on February 23rd when reliable communications transformed American combat effectiveness. Naval gunfire and air support, previously hampered by communication failures, now responded with devastating precision. Unit coordination improved dramatically. Casualty evacuation became more efficient as medical units received timely information. Throughout it all, Sergeant Calloway remained at the center of the communication network, training other radio men in his techniques, repairing damaged equipment, and ensuring the flow of information that had become the American forces' greatest advantage. By the official declaration of the island's capture on March 16th, his modifications had been implemented on more than 200 radio sets across 3 Marine divisions. The morning briefing on March 3, 1945, began like many others in the temporary headquarters of the 5th Marine Division. Officers gathered around sand tables and maps, planning the day's operations against the remaining Japanese strongholds in the northern sector of Iwo Jima. The difference this morning was the presence of Major General Keller E. Rocky, the division commander, and his staff. As reports were delivered on ammunition status, casualty figures, and enemy dispositions, the communications officer made special note of the dramatically improved reliability of radio networks over the past 8 days. Failure rates have dropped from 78% to under 20%, he reported. Artillery coordination and naval gunfire support have improved accordingly. General Rocky, a veteran of campaigns dating back to the First World War, raised his hand to interrupt. "That's a remarkable improvement, Captain. What changed?" The communications officer hesitated, glancing at Colonel Johnson of the 28th Marines. Johnson gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Sir, a sergeant in the 28th developed some field modifications to the SCR 300s that dramatically improved their resilience to local conditions. We've implemented these changes across the division. These would be unauthorized modifications to standard issue equipment," the division supply officer asked sharply. "Emergency field repairs," Colonel Johnson interjected, "utilizing available materials to maintain critical capabilities under combat conditions." General Rocky studied the maps for a moment, then looked up. "I want to meet this sergeant." 3 hours later, Sergeant Andrew Calloway stood at attention before the division commander in a partially destroyed Japanese bunker that served as a forward command post. Exhausted, filthy from 2 weeks of continuous combat, his uniform stiff with dried sweat and volcanic grit, he nonetheless presented himself with military precision. "At ease, Sergeant," General Rocky said. "Colonel Johnson tells me you've revolutionized our communications capability." "Just trying to keep the radios working, sir." "Show me." For the next 20 minutes, Calloway demonstrated his modifications on a disassembled radio set, explaining each change and its purpose. The general and his staff watched with increasing interest as the young sergeant displayed not only technical expertise, but a fundamental understanding of battlefield communication needs. "The standard waterproofing procedures assume occasional exposure to moisture," Calloway explained. "But in amphibious operations, these units are submerged repeatedly. The factory seals fail after the second or third exposure. My modifications create redundant barriers against water intrusion." He held up a small component. "This frequency modulator is particularly vulnerable to volcanic dust. By adding this paraffin coating and adjusting the operating frequency by 0.3 kHz, we maintain clear transmission despite Japanese jamming attempts." When he finished his demonstration, the bunker was silent except for the distant sound of artillery fire. Finally, General Rocky spoke to his communications officer. "Captain, I want these modifications implemented throughout the division immediately, priority to forward units." "Yes, sir." "And prepare a technical bulletin for distribution to the 4th and 3rd Marine Divisions as well." The supply officer began to object. "Sir, these modifications violate equipment protocols established by—" "They work, Major," the general cut him off. "That's the only protocol that matters on this island." Turning back to Calloway, Rocky asked, "How long have you been implementing these changes, Sergeant?" "Since Saipan, sir, on a limited basis." "Against orders?" Calloway stood straighter. "Yes, sir." The general considered this, then nodded once. "Sometimes initiative outranks obedience, Sergeant. You've done well." "Thank you, sir. I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star. The citation will reference your exceptional technical expertise and initiative in maintaining critical communication capabilities under extreme combat conditions. Nothing about unauthorized modifications." "I appreciate that, sir." As Calloway was dismissed, General Rocky added a final comment that would prove prophetic. "When this war is over, Sergeant, the Corps will need to rethink how we develop and deploy communications equipment. Your experience will be valuable in that process." The impact of Calloway's innovations extended far beyond Iwo Jima. By the time American forces assaulted Okinawa in April 1945, his modifications had been standardized across all Marine units in the Pacific Theater. Communication reliability during that brutal campaign remained at unprecedented levels despite torrential rains and difficult terrain. More significantly, his work highlighted a fundamental truth about modern warfare that would influence military doctrine for decades to come. Rigid adherence to equipment specifications developed far from the battlefield could cost lives. Initiative and adaptation at the tactical level often made the difference between success and failure. Japanese military analysis of their defeat at Iwo Jima, captured in documents following the surrender, specifically noted the sudden improvement in American communication capabilities midway through the battle. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo concluded that the Americans had deployed new, technologically superior radio equipment. They never realized that the critical advantage came not from new technology, but from one sergeant's willingness to violate regulations in service of a practical solution. After the war, Andrew Calloway returned to Mississippi to complete his education under the GI Bill. He earned a degree in electrical engineering, married his college sweetheart, and took a position with a radio manufacturer in 1948. When the company began producing military communication equipment during the Korean War, Calloway's combat experience proved invaluable in designing systems that could withstand the rigors of field conditions. In 1952, he was recruited by the Marine Corps Development Center at Quantico, Virginia, where he helped establish new standards for communications equipment that incorporated the lessons of Pacific combat. The field modifications he had once made illicitly became design features in a new generation of military radios. When interviewed for the Marine Corps Gazette in 1963, Calloway reflected on his experience. On Iwo Jima, I learned that sometimes you have to choose between following the rules and completing the mission. I chose the mission, and I'd make the same choice again today. The most important thing wasn't the radio itself, it was what the radio enabled: coordination, support, evacuation of wounded. That's what saved lives. The true measure of Calloway's impact came in letters he received decades after the war. One, from a former artillery officer, read, "Your radio modifications allowed us to deliver supporting fire with unprecedented accuracy. Battalion S2 estimated your work saved at least 800 Marines who would otherwise have faced entrenched positions without adequate fire support." Another, from a corpsman who served with the 28th Marines, was more personal. "I could call for casualty evacuation and actually get a response. Before your radio started working, we lost men simply because we couldn't coordinate medevac under fire. You never knew my name, but 12 Marines I treated lived because help came when I called." Perhaps most telling was the letter from Colonel Johnson, written in 1971, shortly before his death. In war, we talk about heroes who charge machine guns or throw themselves on grenades. But there are quieter forms of courage, the moral courage to do what's right when regulations say otherwise. Your technical disobedience saved more Marines than any single act of battlefield heroism I witnessed in 3 wars. Calloway kept these letters in a simple wooden box in his home office in Biloxi, Mississippi. He never displayed his Bronze Star or spoke much about his wartime service. When he died in 1997 at the age of 75, his obituary mentioned only that he had served with the 5th Marine Division in the Pacific and later contributed to military communications technology. At his funeral, however, 3 former Marines who had served on Iwo Jima appeared unexpectedly. None had known him personally during the battle, but all had learned his name in the decades since. As they placed a small American flag beside his casket, one explained to Calloway's surprised family, "Your father broke the rules that needed breaking, and in doing so, he saved countless lives. Some men earn respect by following orders without question. The truly exceptional ones know when to follow a higher duty." Today, the United States Marine Corps Communications School at 29 Palms, California, includes a case study on what they call the Calloway Doctrine, the principle that initiative and adaptation in maintaining battlefield communications can be decisive factors in modern warfare. Students are taught the technical details of his modifications, but more importantly, they discuss the ethical dimensions of his decision to violate regulations when those regulations conflicted with mission accomplishment and the preservation of life. Military historians studying the Pacific War have increasingly recognized the significance of the communication breakthrough on Iwo Jima. Professor Eleanor Richardson of the Naval War College wrote in 2005, "The dramatic improvement in American coordination following the capture of Mount Suribachi represented a turning point not just in that battle, but in the development of modern combined arms warfare. The ability to precisely direct supporting fires from naval vessels, aircraft, and artillery transformed the operational capability of ground forces. That this transformation stemmed from one sergeant's unauthorized equipment modifications rather than from official doctrine or new technology deployment speaks volumes about the importance of tactical initiative in overcoming battlefield challenges." The lesson of Andrew Calloway's story transcends its specific technical details. In the crucible of combat, where lives hang in the balance, the courage to challenge established procedures when they prove inadequate may be as important as physical bravery in the face of enemy fire. His experience raises profound questions about military culture, the balance between discipline and initiative, and the moral calculus of weighing regulations against practical necessity. Would standard communications procedures have eventually evolved to meet the challenges of Pacific combat? Perhaps. But evolution takes time, and in warfare, time is measured in lives lost. By acting when he did, against orders but in service of his fellow Marines, Calloway compressed what might have been months of official development into days of practical implementation. The Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima, fighting with remarkable courage and tactical skill, were ultimately overcome not just by American numerical superiority and firepower, but by the adaptability that Calloway exemplified. General Kuribayashi's forces, bound by a military culture that emphasized obedience over initiative, could not match the American capacity for rapid battlefield innovation. As we reflect on this little-known aspect of one of the Pacific War's most famous battles, we might consider a question that resonates beyond military history into our everyday lives. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? When regulations conflict with practical necessity, when established procedures fail to meet urgent needs, do we have the moral courage to risk censure by choosing a different path? Andrew Calloway made his choice on a volcanic island 750 miles from Japan, with the lives of his fellow Marines hanging in the balance. His quiet act of technical disobedience, multiplied across a battlefield through the communication network he preserved, altered the course of one of history's most significant battles. Perhaps the true measure of his impact lies not in medals or official recognition, but in the thousands of Marines who returned home from Iwo Jima and subsequent Pacific battles, men who never knew his name but whose lives were preserved by clearer communications, more accurate supporting fire, and faster medical evacuation. Their children and grandchildren living today across America stand as the ultimate testament to one sergeant's courage to break the rules that needed breaking. Remember Andrew Calloway's story and share it so others understand what real courage means. Not just the physical bravery to face enemy fire, but the moral fortitude to challenge convention when lives are at stake. In that understanding lies a lesson as relevant today as it was on the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima in February 1945. The legacy of Sergeant Calloway's initiative extended well beyond the Pacific Theater and World War II. His story became a touchstone in military education, particularly in leadership and technical training programs across all branches of service. By the 1960s, the Calloway Principle had entered the lexicon of military doctrine, the concept that rigid adherence to procedure must sometimes yield to battlefield reality, especially when lives hang in the balance. Lieutenant General Victor H. Krulak, who served as Commanding General of the Fleet Marine Force, Pacific from 1964 to 1968, often cited Callaway in his lectures on adaptive leadership. The finest equipment in the world is worthless without the human ingenuity to employ it effectively under combat conditions, he would tell officer candidates. Sergeant Callaway's radio modifications saved more lives than a battalion of riflemen could have. What made Callaway's story particularly powerful was its clear moral dimension. This wasn't merely a tale of technical improvisation, but of a man who risked his career and reputation to serve a higher purpose. Dr. James Stockdale, naval officer, Vietnam prisoner of war, and later president of the Naval War College, incorporated the Callaway case into his ethics curriculum, challenging students to examine the tension between organizational discipline and individual moral responsibility. Callaway faced what philosophers call a dirty hands problem, Stockdale wrote in 1977. He could keep his hands clean by following regulations and watching his fellow Marines die, or he could dirty his hands by breaking rules to save lives. The essence of moral courage lies in making such choices with full awareness of the potential consequences to oneself. In the Korean War, communications officers who had studied Callaway's innovations arrived in theater better prepared for the harsh winter conditions that destroyed standard equipment. Captain Thomas Whelan, communications officer for the 1st Marine Division during the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, had memorized Callaway's techniques during his training. When temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero and standard radio batteries failed, Whelan implemented modified power sources using Callaway's principles, maintaining vital communication links during the division's fighting withdrawal. Callaway wasn't there, Whelan later recalled, but his spirit was. He taught us that the manual isn't sacred when men's lives are on the line. By Vietnam, Callaway's innovations had been fully incorporated into standard equipment design. The PRC-25 radio, the primary communications tool for American forces, featured waterproofing techniques and environmental protections that traced directly back to his Iwo Jima modifications. Engineers at the Army's Signal Corps laboratories openly acknowledged their debt to the Marine sergeant's field improvisations. In retirement, Callaway rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. His neighbors in Biloxi knew him as a quiet, methodical man who volunteered at the local community college, teaching basic electronics to veterans. Only his family understood the full scope of his impact on military history. His grandson, Michael Callaway, discovered the extent of his grandfather's legacy only after joining the Marine Corps himself in 1985. During communications school at 29 Palms, an instructor mentioned the Callaway Doctrine during a lecture on field maintenance of equipment. "That was my grandfather," the younger Callaway said, surprised to hear the family name. The instructor paused, clearly startled. "Your grandfather was Andrew Callaway? From Iwo Jima?" "Yes, sir." The class fell silent. Then the instructor, a master sergeant with 20 years of service, stepped away from his podium and extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet a member of your family, Marine. Your grandfather saved thousands of lives with what he taught us." Andrew Callaway's legacy reminds us that innovation often comes not from laboratories or corporate research divisions, but from individuals confronting real-world problems with creativity and courage. His story challenges us to consider when rule-breaking becomes a moral imperative, and how organizations can balance necessary standardization with the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. As military forces around the world continue to navigate the complex relationship between technological sophistication and human ingenuity, the lessons of one sergeant's quiet rebellion on a volcanic island in the Pacific remain surprisingly relevant. Sometimes the most valuable battlefield asset isn't superior firepower or advanced technology, but the moral courage to recognize when standard procedures fall short, and the technical ingenuity to find a better way. Each year at the Marine Corps Birthday Ball, when Marines toast their fallen comrades, a few old veterans still raise their glasses with a quiet addition to Sergeant Calloway, who kept the lines open. Most young Marines don't recognize the reference, but the old-timers nod in solemn acknowledgement. They understand that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, comes down to one person's willingness to risk everything for what they know is right. The next time you see a military radio operator, spare a thought for Andrew Calloway. His legacy lives on in every clear transmission from a hostile environment, in every life saved through timely communication, and in every leader who understands that sometimes completing the mission means having the courage to break the rules that need breaking. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means in war and in peace.